Let's get proper. Let's look at the complete book of etiquette, to the chapter on funerals. Now, we're going back here. We're going back to 1952. 1952 to look at the complete book of etiquette. In chapter 16 it says, and it tells us, the family's responsibility when death occurs is partly religious, partly social, and partly legal. Let's see how much of this is still applicable and how much you want to scream at me for what this says. So the immediate procedures when death occurs. Every family should have an emergency strongbox. It should list the names of a funeral director to be called when the need occurs. If the family owns a burial plot or a mausoleum, the deed should be in the file, and it will be required by the funeral director. If one or more members of the family prefer cremation, that would have been a little radical back in the day. A note to that effect should be in the file, even if the request has been placed in the will. A copy of birth certificates, names, addresses of close friends, families. If these things are kept all together, whoever is placed in charge of the funeral will be able to handle the many details. These are all good things so far. Put them on your list to do today, even in 2023. List a bank account, social security numbers, bonds, notes, and mortgages. This is a good idea. Attorneys. If the death occurs and a doctor has not been in attendance, or when the person's religious beliefs preclude medical care, the county medical examiner must be called. This is still applicable. Good stuff. 1952. Whoever is chosen to make funeral arrangements should not be, if possible, any of the most bereaved. So, if you're a spouse, don't go make funeral arrangements because you might be too bereaved. Our attitude toward funerals has changed very much for the better, and we now readily accept the fact that an elaborate funeral whose costs will leave the family in serious debt does shallow honor to the deceased. But a frightened young widow, unable to see ahead and perhaps ill-informed on her late husband's finances, can't be expected to make objective decisions concerning the various costs of the funeral. For a long time, the trend has been towards simple funerals, even among people who can afford elaborate ones. No one but the funeral director knows or cares about the fine details of caskets and their relative expensiveness or inexpensiveness. In fact, many people of sensibility shudder at the pretentious ugliness of expensive caskets, remembering that great heroes are often buried in simple, clean-lined pine boxes. Whoever undertakes the responsibility of the funeral should realize that he or she is entering into a business contract under highly emotional circumstances, and they need help making those decisions. Where expense must be regarded, he is who should be put in charge of making arrangements. He should discuss the necessity with the mortician and make as many decisions as possible himself. It is sometimes months before funds can be released for payment of bills. And in complicated cases, it's sometimes necessary to get the court's permission to pay bills. If the deceased or his family has had some continuous religious affiliation, there is no problem concerning the choice of a clergyman to officiate. Clothing for the burial. Among many people, and especially among Orthodox conservatives and some Reformed Jews, the shroud is still used for burial. Otherwise, the person in charge of the funeral delivers to the funeral director the kind of clothing the deceased would have worn to church, choosing for older women soft materials in solid, quiet tones of lavender, blue, beige, gray, or taupe, with long sleeves and a high neckline. Evening dresses are unsuitable, and black is rarely used. Young girls are often dressed in white. Children are dressed as for Sunday school. Clothes furnished for men should be too, the kind they would have worn to church, usually something from their existing wardrobe. A cutaway is suitable, or a dark blue or dark gray or Oxford suit. Evening clothes are not suitable, nor are sports suits, although in the summer a white linen or any light tropical weave suit may be used. So women can't wear black, but men can wear a light tropical weave suit. People are no longer buried with their jewels. Directions concerning rings or earrings are expected by the funeral director. So the hanging bell, this is something I had never really heard of. So this is actually really interesting. The custom of hanging the bell goes back to the days when doorbells were bells with clappers hung on or adjacent to the door. When someone died, the clapper was muffled in cloth. This later developed into ribbon streamers in white, purple, or black with white or purple flowers. Like mourning, the bell hanging was for the protection of the bereaved, so that anyone approaching the house would do so with quiet dignity. Today, few hang the bell, and it is never done except when the funeral is to take place in the home. When a family still wishes to adhere to the old custom, it so instructs the funeral director, who orders the flowers and has them hung just below the doorbell. So that's interesting. Where the funeral takes place. The telescoping of our living quarters has brought into existence more and more funeral homes. Some simple and functional, like the high-fashioned funeral parlors, where a funeral was held only if there was no suitable home from which it could take place. Today, it's very usual for a funeral to take place in a mortuary chapel, even when home facilities are quite adequate to accommodate a large attendance. The use of the funeral home is usually included in the overall cost of the funeral. If the funeral takes place at home, the largest room is selected. Folding chairs are provided by the mortician. The person in charge of the funeral prepares the death notice, which are then inserted, often by the mortician, in one or more morning paper, in large cities, and evening paper as well. Now there are hardly any papers, which is a crazy change since this. When the person who has died was well known socially or otherwise, it is probable that major papers have a prepared obituary on file already. Each paper has an editor in charge of this kind of news, and the placing of the obituary notice is his cue to get the facts from a family representative if the paper considers the death generally newsworthy. Sometimes when there is no generally known preliminary illness, the word suddenly may be added after the names of the immediate family. If a man was married, his wife is always listed first, not his parents, whose names in this case usually do not appear in the paid notice, but who are mentioned, of course, in news stories, if any. If the funeral is to take place out of town, friends are notified. So even the notice in the paper has restrictions. Attending a funeral. Unless the words funeral private appear in the death notice, any friend or acquaintance of the deceased or his family may attend the services, as do interested strangers if the funeral is in church. They should be very certain that their presence at so difficult of a time will be of real comfort to the immediate family, which usually prefers to be alone with the clergyman at the last brief rites. Sometimes the death notice reads, "Please omit flowers." This should be scrupulously respected. So if it says that, don't send any. They're not talking about everybody but you, is what they're saying. It is important to know that one never sends flowers to an Orthodox Jewish funeral, but they are desired at other funerals. Talks about mass cards, funeral calls. So mass cards are kind of what we call prayer cards now, but back in the day, it used to be when you would pay the church to have a mass in honor of the deceased, and you would have a mass card which would then be set out instead of flowers, telling the family that someone has given in the person's name in that specific way. People are often confused as to where they are expected to make their funeral calls. If they are close friends or relatives, they may call both at the home and the chapel if they wish, leaving their cards or signing the register at the funeral chapel. If calls are received at the funeral chapel, some family representatives should be present at least during the afternoon and early evening when calls are likely to be made. Funeral service talks about pallbearers. Among Christians, pallbearers are always men, and today merely honorary, and that they seldom actually carry the casket and serve only at large funerals of distinguished men. They are never less than 4 and rarely more than 10 chosen for this honor. The pallbearers are usually chosen by the person in charge of funeral arrangements. The family should be represented among the pallbearers, and the other men chosen should accept the honor unless there is some very valid reason for refusing, such as illness. If the casket is carried into the church, the pallbearers precede it, marching slowly 2 by 2 and stepping into the left-hand first pew as they reach the front of the church. While the mortician has men in attendance at every funeral who may act as ushers, and the sexton in a large church has a staff for the purpose, it is preferable that men relatives likely to know many of those attending the funeral act in this capacity, kind of like ushers at a wedding. Interment and grave marking. The minister, rabbi, or priest goes along with the family and pallbearers, if any, to conduct a brief graveside service. A grave is marked with the name of the deceased and the date of his birth and death, and frequently his family relationship. Most cemeteries provide perpetual care of graves as part of the purchase price. It talks about honorariums to the church and to people that are participating. The officiating clergyman should not receive less than $75 to $100. For the average funeral, he usually receives from $5 to $25. So they're talking if it's a larger funeral of notoriety, they should receive more. If the funeral takes place at home, some members of the family make a careful note of the flower offerings as they arrive, removing the cards and recording either on the back of each or in a notebook what it was and who sent it. When the funeral takes place at the funeral home, the funeral director's staff collects the cards and makes the necessary notations for the family. At a church funeral, some member of the family arrives in time to place the cards, so that the note acknowledging flowers, a mass card, or a telegram need not be more than a few words, such as, "Dear Mr. Scott, you are kind indeed to think of us at a difficult time. Your violets were beautiful and comforting. Sincerely, Helen." So lots on thank you notes, which are kind of going by the wayside. Write thank you notes, guys. Doesn't matter what year it is. Send a thank you note. Visible signs of mourning, the widow's bonnet, the black clothes, even for little children, are, I think, happily rarely seen these days. We all mourn the death of those we love, but the healthful thing is to accept the loss as well as we can and gradually make our adjustment to the life we must live without this beloved person. Black has lost much of its meaning as the badge of bereavement ever since, in World War I, Chanel decreed that all fashionable women should mourn with her for her own war loss when she launched the little black dress, which has become an essential of the wardrobe. Prior to that, women seldom, if ever, wore black except for... the book just closed on me. Except for... page. Mourning. Oh, the black chiffon veil is often worn by the bereaved woman at a funeral. Stockings worn with black dresses are usually gunmetal or black. Ordinary street clothes, such as one would wear to church, are acceptable for others attending a funeral. The traditional idea of mourning. Essentially, the wearing of mourning was to give protection to the family as well as to honor the dead. In great families, even the retainers were often put in some degree of mourning, and social activities, even for tiny children, were rigidly circumscribed for as much as 2 years. So people would go in mourning for years at a time and not go do anything. Another reason I believe for the little use of mourning today is the rapid spread of news. When death does occur, everyone concerned is quickly informed by telephone, telegraph, and the daily news. Would their minds not be blown? Whoever was writing this, the Guide to Gracious Living, Miss Amy Vanderbilt, that now you can text and post on social media and not have to send a telegram. Mind-blowing, right? Restrictions and activities. Those who have lost someone close to them naturally feel disinclined toward public festivity. Most of us pursue or try to pursue our usual social course within a week or so after a funeral in our immediate family, with our own feelings and convictions governing our behavior rather than what people might think. Today we go to small dinner parties, to concerts, and the opera. Let him run off his tension, speaking of children, play and make noise away from the mourning house if there are those who cannot understand a child's needs. That's kind of a brief overview of the etiquette when someone dies. This also goes into, this book has, you name it, teen dates, meeting a commuter train, how to write addresses, what happens if you lose your checkbook, managing the servantless household. If you don't have servants, how do you run a household? You need this book, right? Setting the table for breakfast and how you should put glassware. Entering the dining room and how you should do that. I just found this book hilarious. When I found it one day, I was like, oh my goodness, I need to share with you the proper way to have etiquette at a funeral. So how do you think funerals have changed, and etiquette and attendance and what we do for before, during, after funerals as attendees, as family, since maybe 1952 or even 20 years ago? What have been your experiences? Share them with me. Tell me about things you think should be etiquette from 1952 we should still be doing, or should be in our etiquette if we were to write an etiquette book for 2023. Bye.